Welcome to The State of Us.
Beyond mainstream cable news and party lines, with a millennial and a boomer, The State of Us pushes past the noise and uncovers all the issues that matter.
Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Religious, not religious, or somewhere in between, we all have a set of beliefs. We all have a stake in this life. So can any of us be objective about our beliefs? Do atheists and those that claim no religion have any less faith than those of us that are religious? How can we better discuss faith by understanding where and when atheism originated and how it has evolved? A recent book, Unbelievers, An Emotional History of Doubt, answers some of these questions and chronicles the story of, quote, unbelievers. Today, we get to speak with the author. Alec Ryrie is a professor of the history of Christianity at Durham University and is the co-editor of the Journal of Ecclesiastical History. Alec, thank you for joining us.
It's a great pleasure.
And of course, we couldn't begin this critical conversation on faith without
TrueChat senior historian and an educator of more than 30 years. Here is your friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson.
Good evening, Alec. Thanks for taking time to talk to us about your book. I look forward to it.
So let's get started. First up, many people will probably read your book, Alec, from very different perspectives and backgrounds. Who did you write your book for, and what do you hope that people might gain by reading and contemplating your historical account?
Well, I'm trying to talk both to believers and unbelievers, to really anybody who's involved in whatever position in that dance between faith and doubt, partly from a sense that belief and unbelief are very close to each other. They're intimately tied up with each other. What I'm not trying to persuade anybody over to either side, partly because, as we may get to, I think that's pretty hard to do. I'm trying to get people to listen a bit more to each other and talk a bit more to each other and just understand how close they are. So ideally, I'd like the unbelievers to recognize how much intuition and something that's not too different from faith plays in their own choices, and for believers to see how close and how sincere and morally earnest a lot of atheism is, and how seriously it's got to be taken.
So would it be safe to say that it's kind of that philosophy of you'd like people to kind of realize that there's more that we have in common maybe than separates us, which is kind of contrary to the way that people typically view those that might be religious and those that aren't?
Sure. I think in some ways that the great thing that your earnest atheist and your serious believer have got in common is that they recognize that this is a question that matters, whatever you may disagree about the answer to. But it's often, I find, the people who are completely disengaged, who don't even recognize that there's an issue there, who are more seriously separate.
Alec, in the opening of your book, you start by explaining why you believe no one is objective on the matter of belief. Why is this important, and what implications does it carry when a believer and someone who is not a believer get into an intellectual discussion?
All I mean by that is just that none of us are kind of sitting in the top of our ivory tower pronouncing on matters that have got nothing to do with us. We're here. We were born into this world. We're going to die here. We've got a stake in this, whether we like it or not. We're not just talking about some completely abstract philosophical questions. When we talk about the meaning of life, this is the meaning of our life.
One of the things, Alec, that I thought was kind of interesting about the design of the cover of your book, and I know we speak with a lot of different authors, so I know sometimes they're more involved in this, and other times they're pretty hands off. But I did want to ask, the way it's designed is, the word unbelievers is a single word, but believers is actually, highlighted in a different color than the un part. And this is kind of an interesting choice of phraseology to describe atheism. Why did you decide the term unbelievers? Because you mentioned this a lot through the book. Why use that as opposed to something like atheists more specifically?
I played a lot with the language in this, and one of the things I talk about in the book is the history of the word atheism, which I think used to have a much sort of richer and wider range of meaning than we've reduced it to nowadays. And I think it might be nice to recover some of that breadth. But the reason I settled on unbelievers is the reason that you picked up from the cover, that unbelief has got belief embedded in it. It just seemed to me to symbolize the way that these two things are entwined with each other, that you can't, to be a believer is to make choices about what you do and what you don't believe. To believe something is to not believe the other things that are contrary to it. So anybody who is caught up in this game of belief or unbelief in almost any way, I think they've got, like I say, something in common.
So two of the major points you make are about fear and anxiety. These are some of the culminations, I think, of the book. And near the end of the book, you use the metaphor of a stream to explain the root of belief and unbelief. So how are the two concepts interwoven in this way?
Anger and anxiety are the two emotional themes that I see as driving the history of unbelief that I'm tracing in the book. And a lot of the time, those two stories are pretty separate. The kinds of unbelief that arise out of anger and the kind that arise out of anxiety, for a lot of the history, don't seem to have a whole lot in common with each other. These are kind of parallel tracks. The point where I think they come together, and this is where I start thinking about them as streams that converge and turn into something that combines their force, is when they both pick up some moral weight. So when anger turns into not just kicking against the church because you don't like being told what to do, but into real moral outrage, a sense that the church is failing by its own lights, it's not living up to its own standards, and that the unbelief that you're embracing is actually better. And the anxiety can also turn into this sort of this moral urgency of wanting to find a form of a set of beliefs that you can embrace that have got more integrity to them than what you feel that the church is teaching. So I think from both sides you converge on that sense of a moral critique, feeling that Christianity, and I mean we're basically talking about the dialogue between Christianity and doubt here, the feeling that Christianity has failed at its own core task. And in some ways has kind of failed according to its own standards. This pattern that you often see through the history of people measuring Christianity against Jesus Christ and saying that he would not recognize what's been preached and done in his name. And that kind of maneuvers is what seems to me brings the anger and the anxiety together and turns into a really emotionally powerful, as well as intellectually powerful critique of religion in our own time.
We've been talking with Alec Ryrie, author of Unbelievers, An Emotional History of Doubt, about the shared history of believers and their counterparts. But a number of questions still remain. How did we get here, and what lessons can we learn from the past? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Weller.
Religious, not religious, or somewhere in between, we all have a set of beliefs. We're speaking with Alec Ryrie, professor of the history of Christianity at Durham University, about the significance of believers and unbelievers' interwoven history. Next, we are looking back to understand how we arrived at where we are now.
Alec, as a former history teacher, it was very interesting that you picked the years that you did, and the majority of the book is focused on the middle of the 1600s and earlier, and ends in 1660. Why did you pick the particular time frame that you did to discuss the history of unbelievers?
Thanks. It's a good question, and I'm aware that it was a bit of a weird thing to do because the way this story is normally told, it's about the 1700s, the 1800s, and it's about kind of the Enlightenment and philosophy and science and Darwin and evolution and all that kind of thing. But my book started from the idea that the people who are looking for the history of unbelief and atheism in that sort of period are looking in the wrong place, and they're chasing the wrong suspects. My starting point is that I think that unbelief is just as rational and just as irrational. In other words, just as intuitive, just as informed by our emotions as everything else that humans do. And so what I was really interested in is the history of unbelief before the philosophers get their hands on it, and start producing ideas to help explain and justify their unbelief. So I really wanted to get at it in kind of its pristine condition, before people have got arguments to explain it, before people like Spinoza and Thomas Hobbes come along and come up with atheistic philosophies. When people don't have a good set of intellectual reasons not to believe, but they're still struggling with doubt and wrestling with unbelief. I felt that way I could really see unbelief kind of stripped bare in its natural habitat. And so that was where I went hunting.
Well, that makes sense. But can you go into a little further? You mentioned it a little bit in the earlier segment about the word atheism and the evolution of its meaning, because I find it very interesting that during the time period that you were writing about, the definition of the word and the way it was used to describe people is much different than what we use today. Can you go into a little bit of detail there?
Sure. I mean, atheist is a word that, it's a Greek word, goes back to ancient Greece, but it literally means without God or without gods. Maybe a better translation into modern English would be if we called somebody godless. It could mean somebody who postulates that there is no God as a philosopher. But it could also mean somebody who lives as if there were no God, or somebody who, even if they claim to believe, as the modern philosopher John Gray says, somebody who has no use for the idea of God in their life. And when this word was rediscovered in the Renaissance, and turned into a word that shows up in every European language by 1600. In one form or another, it's that breadth that they're using it in. Certainly, they use it to refer to people who are claiming that there's no God or doubting that there is a God, but also that much wider range of people who are living godless lives. And I think, it's truer to the original meaning. I also think it's kind of useful to understand that range of different forms of unbelief and what's the difference between making some kind of intellectual claim about the being or non-being of God, and the maybe much more important question of how you actually live your life.
So as we read your book, Alec, we arrive at a number of places where you're able to assert maybe what people might have been thinking or feeling. And obviously, this is an ongoing debate in history about how much we can or cannot infer or ascertain without firsthand accounts. So how did you make these choices in your book when you arrived at these places? And what assumptions should people be aware of when they start reading your book?
That's a great question. I mean, accessing people's beliefs and inner lives in the past. Well, I mean, even accessing anybody else's inner life in the present is hard enough. I tried to go for first-hand accounts wherever I could find them, and there are quite a lot of people who give us some some real account, either contemporaneously in letters or diaries, or looking back on their on their lives about what they actually believe. But we've also got a lot of preachers and playwrights and so on who are depicting it or imagining what unbelief might be like. And those are really interesting, but you've also always got to remember that you're dealing here with what somebody else is imagining. It tells you something about what the whole society thinks, about what the stereotypes of the time are. You've got to be really careful to jump from that to people's real experience. And one of the things I try and do in a couple of the chapters of the book is draw some distinction between the pretty crude stereotypes of what it meant to be an atheist that were circulating in these times, and the way the people who really were wrestling with doubt described their own experience. Sometimes there's quite a gap.
Right, because you make it very clear during some of this period of history that you're writing about that people's lives, when the church was in control of the government, that people's lives could be taken from them if they began to claim there was no God or that they weren't a member of the church. So how difficult was that to even then look into the past, into the history, and find, people who were speaking in that manner?
Sure. It's really hard. If you're in a situation where,
it was life and death, literally life and death during the time period that you were focusing on.
Yeah. Blasphemy was a capital crime. There's a student who is hanged for atheism in Edinburgh as late as 1698. So it was definitely something that people were careful about. And you've got to read all of these statements through that filter, that that people are being careful. It does also mean that some of the sources that we've got for this are actually from trial records. When people are arrested and put on trial for statements which potentially could cost them their lives. And of course, under those circumstances, you've got maybe malicious witnesses, and you've got people who are desperately trying to explain, no, when I said that wasn't really what I meant. So all of this you've got to handle, with extreme care. But, hey, this is the fun about doing this history. If it's not bad to talk about other people's lives and deaths as a matter of fun, when you can really, dig into these texts and get a feeling for what's going on in them and tease the meanings apart, it's kind of a privilege, because you do get the sense sometimes that you're really hearing the voices of these people who lived and died 300-400 years ago.
Near the end of your book, you make comparison is not a good word, but you take two major players in history, Jesus Christ and Hitler, and you talk about how they kind of are the photo ops for believers and unbelievers, and how those two figures, or those two thoughts that people have when you use those words, shape society's worldview. What would you like for our listeners to take away from this comparison that you make here? Because I thought it was very interesting how you did that.
The point I was trying to suggest there is that if you go back, just 100 years ago, don't need to go back any further than that, in America, in Europe, and you ask people, who is the most morally potent figure in our whole culture? It's definitely going to be Jesus Christ. And that applies whether you're a believer or an unbeliever. You'll find, atheists right across the spectrum in late 19th, early 20th century, who will go out of their way to say, I don't believe in God, but I believe that Jesus Christ is the best example of human morality that we've got. And anybody who denies that outs themselves as a monster. They're somebody who you can't deal with. Nowadays, I think we've moved to the point where the most morally powerful figure in our culture is Adolf Hitler. It's possible to critique or ignore Jesus, But nowadays, anybody who goes out, who says anything nice about Hitler, outs themselves as a monster. Now, I mean, I don't have a problem with this. If you're going to choose one human being as a symbol of evil, I'm struggling to come up with a better one. But I think it's really interesting, a really important part of our cultural story that we've moved to the point where first of all, that we define our morality now by somebody who's an icon of evil rather than by somebody who's a symbol of absolute goodness.
That idea maybe that at one point, right, or up until a certain point, we looked and said, this is what you want to be. And now it's more of we look at and say, this is what you don't want to be.
That's true, but I think it goes beyond that. It also means that now we're saying, and this applies in our religious life to some extent, it certainly applies in our politics, we're no longer nearly so good at saying this is the ideal, this is the good that we're aspiring to. We're much better at saying this is what we hate, this is what we're against. And I think that's got a real cost. Yeah,
that's an interesting theme that you touched on there, because it's one that we inevitably talk about on this program all the time, is that idea of, it can be, sometimes it's harder to know what, especially in our politics, people are for, but it's easier and easier to know what people are against. And that's an interesting theme that you touched on there. And I'm glad we had the opportunity to talk about it. How can we use the lessons of unbelievers in our modern society? And how might these observations better inform our conversation about faith? Well, that's what Lance and I will discuss in the next segment of the show. Alec, we enjoyed your book and appreciate you taking time to speak with Lance and me.
Great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Alec Ryrie is the author of Unbelievers, An Emotional History of Doubt, which you can purchase by visiting thestateofus.org or anywhere books are found. How can we use the lessons of unbelievers in our modern society, and how might these observations better inform our conversations about faith in the future? To find out, keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back.
We are The State of Us. Here's your host, Justin T. Willer.
Today we had the opportunity to speak with Alec Ryrie, who is the author of a recent book, Unbelievers, An Emotional History of Doubt. Now, this book raises a number of questions, and we had the opportunity to discuss and get some answers from the author himself in the first two segments of today's program. But now Lance and I are going to get to talk about what are the biggest takeaways and what are the implications of these, right, in our everyday life. And the big one, Lance, for me, was near the end of the book, and kind of what we ended the last segment on was this discussion about these two figures that we often refer to when we're talking about morality, kind of on the spectrum too, right? Jesus Christ.
Right, and kind of through the microscope of how we view things today. Instead of looking at it through a positive light, we tend to look at things through the negative side of the microscope, right?
Right. And that's this idea of Jesus Christ and Adolf Hitler. And when you think of Jesus Christ, it's a lot about, well, this is what we stand for. And when you think about Hitler, it's a lot of this is what we stand against. And he used that, right, to kind of talk about that is a very potent item to discuss in today's context, because we have so many of these conversations where, and this is something that I've heard said a lot in recent years, a criticism, right, of organized religion, is, I used to know what the church stood for, but now I know what it stands against, and it's getting harder and harder to know what it's for. And this isn't, obviously, our discussion here is not strictly about whether or not organized religion is good. It has more to do with how this expands into not just religion and faith, but into every facet of our lives, as these things often do.
I was going to say, are you bringing up the fact of the church, or of the fact of society, how we view everything in such a negative fashion now? That's what I got from it. And that's okay. Maybe we got two different things. I wasn't really taking what Alec had to say through the lens of the church, but more as a lens of society, that we look at things negatively, that this is bad and this is evil and this is why, fake news. I can't believe you, you're lying to me all the time. We take everything in this negative vein instead of trying to find positive, the old psychology, description of, when you put water in a glass and you stop at the midway point, is it half full or half empty? With a lot of half empty attitudes out there, which is what I was equating the author's comparison to Hitler, vile, evil, everything's a negative, instead of looking at things as a positive and trying to, as my grandmother would say, find the silver lining. Where's the positive in the person? Where's the positive in the situation? I had a friend describe a friend that we lost many years ago that way, that our friend had the ability to find the positive in every situation, and how we've lost that today.
Well, I think that's an interesting takeaway, because it is different. I think it's equally valid. I appreciate that takeaway, because it is a different way to look at, right, this idea of the good versus the bad. But like you said, what I immediately moved towards was the concept of, especially in our politics, right? And it's similar to that, positive and negative. I mean, we spend more time on the negative. It's more about the Republicans saying, I don't like these things the Democrats are doing, or the Democrats saying, I hate these things that the Republicans are doing. And we talked a lot about this as a problem, right, in elections. And we talked about, one of the keys to victory that is so often overlooked is it can't just be about why your opponent is bad. It has to be about, why are you good and what are you going to do, right? And so often it's not about that anymore. It's a lot about, we
don't do that anymore. We don't hear that.
Right. It's the other person said this, or they're terrible because of this, right? And it's not, I'm the right person because, or I'm going to do X, Y, Z.
I was just reading a book review on a biography of Vice President Pence, and they made that statement about him, that as he was coming up in Indiana as a talk show host and a politician, he lost his first campaign. And he said, I'm not going to be negative anymore. If I have to be negative, I don't want to win. And then the author brought up some, reminding people, because it was a biography, it wasn't an autobiography. And I'm not even sure it was, that Mr. Pence, Vice President Pence, said it was okay. But that was what the vice president had stated on the record early in his political career. And the author in the review was talking about what deal has he made to now be the vice president for President Trump, and I'm not trying to be mean or draw conclusions. I think we'd all have to agree that President Trump bashes those people who don't believe like he does. He is nothing but the negative. I mean, that's pretty much, other than he's really positive about what he's done, but he's negative about anybody who disagrees with him. And so here's Vice President Pence early in his political career who says, I don't want to be like President Trump is, yet that's who Vice President Pence has hooked his wagon to, so to speak, politically. So just an interesting concept, as you said, with our politicians. Is this the new normal? I mean, is that where you're coming from with politics, is that we can't win by being the good guy? We can't win by taking the high road and praising everything that everybody does, and this is a good idea, but I think my idea is better. You know what I'm saying? Why do I have to bash your idea? Why can't I just say that's a good start and build on it and say we need to do this? Like, instead of we're not doing enough testing on the COVID, why not say, okay, we've made great gains in the number of tests that we've been able to do in the last 6 weeks, but we need to take it another step. We need to continue to do more. It's not, you can say the same thing, but say it in a positive manner instead of an attacking or negative manner.
Well, it's the nitpicking too, right? I mean, it's this idea that sometimes we get bogged down on those statements, and that happens a lot on both sides of the aisle. I mean, I think one of the things you can say about President Trump, regardless of what you think of him, is that he does not like to get into the weeds. And this is, I think, something that is very true when you think about how he responds to criticisms of when he doesn't say something exactly right? Or when he states something that's not true, or isn't phrased in a way that is as accurate as it should be, where he says something about testing, right? And then it's, we go further than that. And, it's like, he gets aggravated, right, at reporters when they go that route. And I'm not saying reporters shouldn't. I'm just saying it's interesting how as a society, and especially in political life, we tend to get bogged down in that. And that kind of harkens back to what we talked about in the first segment of the show, this idea of anger and anxiety, right? Which, again, it's amazing how so much of the themes that are discussed when we talk about faith. I'm thinking back to a month ago, Lance, when we had Timothy Beale on and his book about the Bible, right? So many of these things, regardless of whether or not you're a Christian, an atheist, neither, or you're somewhere in between, right? Regardless of that stuff, we all are affected by some of those conversations that are had around our idea of faith. And I think this is one of those really important areas to understand. So much of what we do as people, and a lot of times the bad decisions that we make can be born of anger and anxiety, right? We're anxious.
They're driven by those two emotions.
Yes, because they're very visceral. I think they make us. We don't like how we feel when we experience those.
We go along and we don't really care unless we get angry. And then when something happens that makes us angry, then we feel like we have to respond. But up until then, things are happening all the time and we choose not to respond to them because that anger button hasn't been pushed in our DNA. And then the same thing with anxiety. I'm not scared. I'm not anxious. I'm not anything until then all of a sudden something happens and then I am. And then I change my lifestyle. I change my behavior. I change my attitude. So I think that's very big. And in the book, that theme goes through all 200 pages of every decision that people made about their belief or unbelief was either done by anger or anxiety or the combination of the two. And I think your point is well taken that we all do that in all aspects of our life, not just in our faith or our belief or unbelief, but in the way we deal with other people and the issues that come up in our everyday lives, in our everyday living.
And I think we have to be careful of that because that is when we get angry and anxious, from a biological standpoint, we know your mind and your body gets flooded with all of these endorphins, and all these physiological changes take place when you're in these heightened states of awareness, ready to defend yourself, essentially, physically, defend yourself. But that leads to a change in mental state. And we can make a lot of very irrational decisions when we're in these states. And people can make those decisions all the time, but you're even more likely to do so because you're just relying on instinct at that point, right? It's what do I have to do to survive? And so when you get angry or when you get anxious or both, you're eager and willing to accept solutions that you might not otherwise accept. And I think that like Lance said, it speaks to when we talk about spirituality and faith and religion, but it also speaks to how we just behave when we're talking about things that tend to elicit those emotions, like politics. It's one of the reasons that, a lot of families, when they get together with the extended family, have that rule about we don't talk about politics and we don't talk about religion because you're just asking, right, to get those emotions going because these are things that for a lot of us, we have very strong feelings about based on our experience. So I think that's the To me, that was the big takeaway, because at one point, he helped explain that, his opinion is that believers and unbelievers have way more in common than they realize. And I think that's interesting, because when we think about atheists and Christians, or anybody who's religious or has a faith, and those that do not, or do not believe that there's a higher power, right? We tend to think of those as these polar opposites. And I think the point of the book is understanding that one of the reasons he goes further back is to highlight that that's not how unbelief started, right? Unbelief was as much about faith as belief was. Because there wasn't those rational arguments to be had yet. They didn't have a lot of what your atheists today often point to.
Yeah, you take down, with anger and anxiety, you lose your filters in making your decisions, and you make rash decisions. But then, as your point there, whether you're a believer or an unbeliever, you approach the questions or the issue with the same questions. You just come up with a different answer. So you really are looking at the same situations, the same events, the same words, the same sermons, the same stump speeches, whatever it is that you're looking at, we all come to them with the same questions. We just come away with a different answer.
When I asked Alec Ryrie why he wrote his book and who it's for, part of his response was, he said his hope was that his book would be for both believers and unbelievers, and that it would provide an opportunity or help people realize that they can listen, talk, and discuss things without getting anxious and angry at one another. And I think, Lance, that is a perfect, almost, right? It's almost like a rewording of our mission statement. I don't know, but what is the mission?
Do we even need to read it? Right? That our mission. Well, you have to, because there are people that tune in for this part of the show.
That's true. They show up just for this. That's why Bradley's here, our producer. He's just here for the end.
So, our mission, as you were alluding to, our mission statement here at True Chat is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And to promote this, you need to get the word out. And if you're enjoying our shows, you got to tell other people. And when you do that, and they say, well, how in the world do we get a hold of this podcast? Well, you can tell them that we're on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, or anywhere else fine podcasts are found.
Like Lance said, obviously this program is a podcast. I'm sure many of you are listening that way. And those episodes are released Tuesdays and Thursdays, but it's also a syndicated radio program. So you can find out more information about our show at thestateofus.org. We've got books, links, and lots of other great resources. So be sure to check it out. For The State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
And I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our guest, Alec Ryrie, the author of today's book that we discussed, and of course, as always, our producer, Bradley Butch, for making this show possible. And thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.